you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Okay, our speaker today has been here before, and he lives in Latrobe and knew Arnold Palmer and Mr. Rogers, and that's what he talked about. He wrote a book about that. Today's book, I'm going to let him explain. I asked him, what's this book about? He said, well, I ponder some interesting questions. Like, why do couples always sleep on the same side of the bed? So what the hell do I know? I don't know what the answer to that is. These are the questions that he ponders in this book. And I'm not going to even venture it. I'm going to let him explain.
Okay.
Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. My books, I have the most diverse bookshelf of any writer in America, I think. I've written about self-help, a fiction novel about the last baby boomer, children's host golfers, and I say the only thing my books have in common, they have two things in common. One is none of them make any money. And the other thing is they all ask the big questions in life, like why are we here? Where do we go when we die? What is our purpose in life? And ask questions that are important only to me, like if fans of the band The Grateful Dead are called Deadheads, what does that make those of us who revere the book Moby Dick? I stand humbly before you today, humbly, as the most handsome, smartest, most fit, 120-year-old man you've ever met. I realized I was 120 after my daughter, I had a birthday and I turned 52. This was about 6 years ago. And my daughter said, wow, 52, you are really old. And after I got done chaining her to a tree in the woods so the bears could teach her some manners, I thought about it and I thought, I lied to her. I'm not 52, I'm actually 100. Because I've lived my life, it's been a very unusual life. I haven't had a job since 1992. And I started out as a journalist. And I've had all this time to myself since 1992. I say, like people, I started out calling myself a journalist, and then I became a writer, and I still don't call myself an author, I call myself a prostitute. And people say, what do you do for a living? My office is in the third floor of the Tin Lizzie. The Tin Lizzie is a building in Latrobe that dates back to the 1750s. There's 3 bars in it in my office. My office is on the top floor, and people say, where do you go when you're not having fun at the Tin Lizzie? I said, that's never happened. But I said, but if it ever does, I just go somewhere else in the Tin Lizzie. But I figured out what I do for a living is I stare out windows. I stare out windows, and I do that for like an hour at a time, then I type for like 3 minutes, then I resume staring out the window. And it might surprise you, but that does not pay very well. But it's led to such an interesting life. Jerry's right, I do philosophize a lot. And some things like, this got me into trouble. I spoke to some high school kids the other day, And I lost the audience when I told them this line. I said, you want to be so at peace with the world, the only thing you have left to get off your chest are your nipples. And that really alarmed the senior high schoolers, that I was talking about nipples. But I also have other things like this. And my wife is a very pretty woman. We've been married 25 years. And I'm a very pro-marriage, and I say I'm pro-marriage, yet I still say, if marriage is so great, how come there's no Mrs. God? But I said this, women look into mirrors and see flaws no one else can detect. Many of your wives are like that, very pretty women. They look into the mirrors and say, this is wrong, this is wrong. Men look into those same mirrors and see perfection no one else can detect. But I have an intense interest in other people. I think that's why I consider myself such a rich man, in ways that other people don't. I went to Ohio University, and I graduated there in 1985. The only thing I learned at Ohio University was to never mix bourbon and ouzo. And then I got my first job in Nashville, Tennessee at the Nashville Banner. And the general manager there called me in for an interview, and he goes, how long were you on the school paper? He said it in a southern accent I could barely understand. I said, I was on it for 2 years. He goes, what'd you do the other 3 years? Drink beer? And I said, yes, sir. He hired me right away. But Nashville is a great place to learn to be a storyteller, because everybody on every bar stool has a great story. And I keep going back to bars because that's been a big part of my life. It's just, you find so many interesting people in bars. You know, I say I love the people that go to my church. And the difference between church people and bar people is that church people say they're sinners and they're ashamed of it and seek forgiveness. Bar people say they're sinners and they brag about it. But you'd be sitting in a bar stool there and you'd be talking to someone and you'd say, I was very interested in these people. And I'd said, how are you? What do you do? And he goes, my name's Don Schlitz. I said, what do you do? He goes, I'm a songwriter. I said, have you written anything I've heard of? He goes, you ever heard of Kenny Rogers, the Gambler? I said, yeah. And he goes, I wrote that. And so then he got up on stage and played The Gambler, which I'd heard like 1,000,000 times. But when he played it, it was entirely new. It was like riveting to hear the songwriter play it. So I became more interested in other people. And the more interested I became in other people, the more interesting I became to other people. I think most of us have a need to talk and talk about ourselves. I'll listen all night long. And I want to hear what makes people tick. If you drive a garbage truck, I want to know how that makes you feel every day going to work and drive a garbage truck. If you're a podiatrist, what do you do when somebody's got ticklish feet? You know, I want to know all those kind of things. If you've made a lot of money, I want to know if you ever had to break some ethical boundaries to get that money. I want to know how people function like that. And so I was after Nashville Banner, I wasn't making any money down there, which is another theme that runs throughout my life, is this no making money. And my idea of a splurge then was getting a pizza with pepperoni and sausage. So if I was getting 2 toppings, I felt like a real big shot that day. So I decided to move back to Pittsburgh, because why wouldn't you move back to Pittsburgh when you're 25 years old? I mean, Pittsburgh's great. I love it here. But somebody in the meantime said, well, you should work for National Enquirer. If you want to be a storyteller, they've got the greatest stories in the world. I thought, why would I do that? Like I mistakenly thought some of their headlines were baby born with wooden leg. That's not a true story. But that was the Weekly World News. And so I ended up doing stories for National Enquirer. My mother, I told her I was going to work for National Enquirer, and she was very embarrassed. She said, oh, that's terrible. And I said, but it'll make me so much more interesting. I'll be able to be a much better storyteller. And she said, you're already interesting enough. And I said, I can be more interesting. And for National Enquirer, I started doing stories like Town Saved by Giant Ball of Twine. It's a town in Darwin, Minnesota. This eccentric farmer started collecting all the twine from his farm, and he made this house-sized ball of twine. It's been in like 5 Chevy Chase movies. And when he died, he willed the ball of twine to Darwin, Minnesota, and they put a pagoda over it and started charging people $5 a head to come visit it. They made enough money to build the Twine Ball Inn and the Twine Ball Restaurant. So other magazines would put economic drive from twine succeeds. The Enquirer puts town saved by giant ball of twine. And I think my lead for that one was You wouldn't want to be in Darwin, Minnesota the day giant cats invade. And then I had a story about a man who was struck by lightning 3 times and never felt cold again. And they said, to secure his interest in getting the story for the National Enquirer, I had to tell him, I said, this is a serious story. It's going to be medically based and just talk about the phenomenon. I said, we're not going to make any fun of you. He goes, don't you dare make fun of me. He goes, this is a serious issue. So I get the story and I turn it to my editor and he goes, that's great. He goes, now call Harold Deal up was his name. He goes, call him up and see if he'll agree to go to the penguin hutch at SeaWorld and pose with penguins and ice all over him. So I said, Mr. Deal, remember that serious story we were talking about? I said, we would like to fly you to SeaWorld and put you in a penguin hutch in a penguin costume and put penguins and ice all over you. He goes, yeah, I'll do that. That'll be fine. And the headline for that one was, hell will freeze over before Harold Deal does. But the great Enquirer stories were always the ones where they throw you into some situation where you were either terribly embarrassed or invigorated in some way. They called me up one day and said, we want you to wear, Braveheart was the big movie out at that time, in '94, I think it was. They said, we want you to wear a kilt around a blue-collar town like Latrobe and just see how people react to a man in a kilt. So there we have, it takes a brave heart to get dressed in a kilt. And then they said, so that was fun. You know, I had people making fun of me, but we had a good time doing it. They said, people ask, you know, did you wear anything under your kilt? And I was told to say, a gentleman would not respond to that question. I will say, if you had a list of the 5 people you would most want to moon in Westmoreland County, I got 3 of them that day. So they called me up like a couple weeks later and said, we have another way out story for you. And I said, what do I have to wear, a dress this time? And they said, no, this time if you refuse it, you'll be not as manly as you think. They said, we want to put you on a bed of nails, put 50 pounds of concrete on your chest and smash it with a sledgehammer. This became the only story I ever did for National Enquirer that was utterly false. Because it says, I lay on a bed of nails and took a sledgehammer blow to the chest, but I felt no pain. I said, I felt terrible pain. I said, why did you put that I felt no pain? They said, well, it's a victimless crime. Nobody cares if you got hurt. And then I was sitting there one day watching Showtime, and they had a special on with Elvis Presley's cooks. And Elvis is like the patron saint of the National Enquirer. And this one woman was saying, I'd bring in these sandwiches, these pork chop sandwiches that were just dripping with butter. He'd be laying there in bed, and he'd say, bring me 6 more of these right away. I love Elvis. And I thought, but what would that do to a normal human being, that kind of diet? So I called the Enquirer. They said, get right on it. And I went out and got the Elvis Presley cookbook. I want you all to sing it with me. Are you hungry tonight? And I gained 20 pounds in 1 week on the Elvis Presley diet. We made all that food up for one afternoon. We had so much food, the golden retriever, we were throwing him chunks of it because we couldn't eat it all. The golden retriever went and hid behind the furnace in the basement. He'd had too much food. And then there was a story about a 17-year-old girl who was truant so often down in Georgia, the judge got fed up and said, you've got to be handcuffed to your mother so your mother will always know where you are. And so the mother, after like 24 hours, called the judge. She was going out of her mind. She said, I can't stand this much time. This togetherness is driving me crazy. At the time I was engaged to my wife. And I thought, what would happen if 2 people supposedly at the peak of their love were handcuffed together for 72 hours? They said, get right on it. So we did that. And we went, like, she had to come with me to dart night. So I'm handcuffed like that. I almost stabbed some of my friends with errant darts. I had to go to the gym with her. Since we were on the expense account for the Enquirer, we went to the Lamont for dinner. They ended up cutting our food for us like in little baby-sized pieces so we could enjoy it without stabbing ourselves. And then there was the great picture. We had to go to a beauty salon, and my wife was under that big hair dryer thing, and I'm handcuffed sitting next to her reading the National Enquirer. So they loved that one. But I'd find these other stories that I could run. I didn't want to be a National Enquirer reporter the rest of my life. I thought it would give me core stories that I could use forever in different places. And One of them was, I found out that there was a bar in Washington, Bellingham, Washington. It was a serial killer bar. There were 3 serial killers that were regulars at this one bar. Ted Bundy, John Muhammad, the Washington sniper, and the Green River killer. They all were regulars at this bar at one time or another, and they were all considered good customers. And I talked to the bartender. I went out there, and the bartender said, yeah, they were all good guys. They all tipped good. They didn't start any trouble on my shift. And they said, there was even another guy here. He cut his roommate's head off. And I said, what was he like? He goes, well, he was just an asshole. But then they called me up one time and said, so a story like that I can use throughout different places. I did a travel story on it. I started working with Maxim and Esquire and some of these other magazines. And I came up with an idea. We were having a lot of climate troubles back then in the late 90s as we are today. And I wanted to find out how FEMA would react to, they said these were all acts of God. A tornado, a hurricane is not an act of God, it's weather. An act of God from the Bible is like a plague of locusts, where the water turns to blood. And I said, well, how would FEMA deal with a real act of God? And we took the acts of God out of the Bible and asked James Lee Witt, who ran FEMA for a number of years. I said, how would FEMA react? He was out of the business, so he was having fun with it. He goes, well, if it was a plague of frogs, he goes, I'd get the Fish and Wildlife Commission there. We'd have a roundup. He goes, and being an Arkansas boy, we'd have one hell of a barbecue. And then I kept others like that, and he kept bringing it back to the bureaucracy. I said, what would you do if the rivers all turned to blood? He goes, I'd consult a higher power, and I don't mean Dick Cheney. But then the last one, we gave him the answer to this because it was a fun story, and we said, if you want to use this as your answer, we'll type that in. We said, what would FEMA do if a 600-foot lizard stepped out of the Atlantic Ocean and started squashing Manhattan? He said, that would not be an act of God, that would be an act of Godzilla, and you call the Department of Defense. I met 2 guys that 2 of the men I treasure most of meeting and stories were completely opposite men, except for the joys of life. John Klaus and Angelo Camerata. Does the name Angelo Camerata remind anyone? There was a bar in Westview, and he had that bar for a long time. John Klaus fought in World War II and served in the Battle of the Bulge. And he said, as he was ducking bullets down there, he said, if I get out of this alive, I'm going to live an entirely original life. And he became the world's most traveled man when I talked to him. He'd been to 365 of the world's 367 countries, islands, and territories. He'd been married and divorced 6 times. And he said, when I tell a woman I like to travel, they think we're going to be drinking coffee on the banks of the Seine River in Paris. He goes, they don't realize that we're going to be taking like an overland bus road for 12 hours from Ouagadougou, Kenya to Tanzania. And he said he had this one bus ride. He said the bus driver had a girlfriend in every village, and he'd stop for an hour and go have his party, and they'd just sit on the bus and wait. He said he had this one woman with him, and he said she was there, and she must have washed 6 pounds of dirt out of her hair. He goes, I never saw her again. But he was always the guy I would call if I had something interesting to ask, like Esquire was doing an experiential story, like what's it like to survive a plane crash, or what's it like to come back from death, or anything like that, all these oddball stories. And they asked me to do it. Find someone and ask them what it's like to eat testicles. Mountain oysters. You know, that's kind of a delicacy in the Rockies, is they castrate the bulls and fry up the oysters, they call them. And I said, John, have you ever eaten testicles? He goes, what kind? I said, something unusual. He goes, well, I had elephant balls once. He goes, it was at a restaurant in Berlin. It was called Elephant Soup Burundi. He goes, and no, it didn't come in a really, really big bowl. He was a great man. Now, he got famous traveling all over the world. The other man, Angelo Camerata, got famous for never leaving a room he was in. It was a bar. And this man was the world's longest serving bartender, and he ran Camerata's Cafe in on the north side, and then eventually in Westview. And he started tending bar April 19th, 1933 at midnight, the exact minute Prohibition ended. And he tended bar for another 80 years. and he had to quit after 80 years because of health reasons. His son was too sick to run the bar. He would go every day and pick up his favorite customer. He'd drive his customer to the bar, and he'd work his shift with him, and then he'd drive the guy home. And he gave me one of my favorite answers to any question I've ever asked. This was a joyful man. And I said, John, Ange, what's one of the best years of your life? That's something you ask somebody when they're seasoned like that. He was about 100 years old then. And he said, the best years of my life, I think, were the years between I was 36 and 87. And I just love that sweep. Like, if you ask me, I would always go back to when my children were babies. You know, I just loved being a father to little babies like that. Now they sass me and tell me I'm old at 52. So, but that's a great answer now. I taught creative nonfiction at Point Park University. And for my final test for these students, I brought in Ange Camerata. And Ange he was 98 at the time. He drove in himself, and this old man comes walking in, and I said, this is your final exam. I said, this is Ange Camerata. Ask him questions, and then write a story about him. And these kids got so mad, because they'd say, who are you? He said, I'm Angelo Camerata. They go, what do you do? I'm a bartender. Where do you live? Westford. And everything he said made him seem more and more ordinary. And then finally one kid blurted out, he said, what makes you so special? He said, I'm the world's longest serving bartender. I've been tending bars since 1933, and I'm in the Guinness Book of World Records. And it just became magical after that. I mean, these students just started saying, what was your favorite customer? His favorite customer was Josh Gibson. He tended bar for Josh Gibson of the Negro Leagues. And we talked for hours. He'd been married for 75 years too. So he answered questions about that. And then afterwards, we all got in our cars and drove out to Westview, and he served us beers. It was a magical night. I really loved that man. When he died in 2015, it was the only time I've ever felt like taking a selfie with a casket. You're getting down there and I'm like this. But I didn't do it out of respect for him. I said that my office is above my favorite bars. And if you're ever out at the Tin Lizzy, come out and say hello. People come up and they've read my books, a lot of people from all over, and they know I'm in the Tin Lizzy on the 3rd floor, and they come up very sheepishly, and they knock on the door of my little shabby office, and they say, I'm sorry, we don't want to disturb you. And I said, hell, I've been disturbed since 1992. Because I didn't think at this time I'd be, like people say, since I have this association with this bar, they say, oh, you must be just like Ernest Hemingway. I said, yeah, it's impossible to tell us apart. If you take away all the accolades, all the prestige, all the money, and all the 6-toed cats, we couldn't tell us apart. But I'm very happy up there. And, but I thought by now I would be a very rich, successful author. I'm a successful author, I'm not rich. But my first idea for a book was The Last Baby Boomer. And I thought that would send me on a path to fame and fortune. It has not. But I still think it's a good book. The Last Baby Boomer will be 112 years old in the year 2076. And people are going to be so sick of baby boomers, they're going to put the last one in a museum, charge $25 to be with him for 15 minutes. If you're in the room when he dies, you win the jackpot. And when I was about 45 or 50, I started realizing that I had once been a promising young writer. When you're about 50, there's no promise left, and you're not young anymore. So I started thinking, I was confounded by why I was happy, and all my friends that had country club memberships, nice cars, nice hotels, nice vacations, that seemed to be unhappy. They had divorce, they had estrangement, they had addiction in their families. So I started writing a book about the list of things of why I was happy. And it had lists like things like, take your family to a movie, and when the credits start, ask your wife to go out and get popcorn. And my wife, I'd say, go get some popcorn now before the movie starts. And she'd go out there, and while she was gone, we'd move the family to a darker part of the theater. And so she'd come in and go, Chris, where are you? And I wrote that, and I had 250 ideas that I thought were really strong. And I showed it to her, and she goes, well, it's good, it's good, but it's very earnest. I thought, oh no, even people named Ernest don't want to be called Ernest. And so she said, you should really have 500, and it should be more fun. And so I ended up coming up with 500, but number 251 I wrote, never forget how a long marriage can be a terrific antidote to excessive ego. So I ended up coming up with those other ideas. And those were things like, don't complain next time someone does or says something that throws a real monkey wrench into an already difficult situation. Instead, do something constructive and try and find a loose monkey. Open an art gallery with nothing on the walls, then invite people to enter and be greeted by 40 guys who say nothing but, "Hi, I'm Art." I always took my kids to the county fair, and they used to despise this. We'd go to the rabbit exhibit, and I'd stand there at the doors and I'd say, "Can any bunny find me some bunny to love?" That drove them crazy. Paleontologist is a difficult word to say and a difficult word to spell. Paleontologists study dinosaur bones. I propose we start calling paleontologists boners. So I put those together. I had 500, and the book does very well. The best compliment, I've had people who invite me in to speak about it, and I'm very pleased with the reaction it gets. Makes me very happy. I've sold 200 books at a time to some people. It sells really well. Groups love it. And it has, I did a second edition now, has 1,000 items in that, 1,000 of those things that keep popping out of my head when I stare out the window. But the best was a woman called me from Illinois around Christmas. She said she wanted 30 copies of the book. I said, "That's great, you've got 30 friends?" She said, "No, I've only got 10 friends, but I've got 20 people I want to give it to at a local cancer ward where I know it'll make people happy." That's been the best compliment I got out of it. And that's wonderful. About that time, I was living on Arnold Palmer Drive, and they changed the name of my street from Main Street in Youngstown to Arnold Palmer Drive. And I thought, well, this will impress some shallow golf editors, that I may not know Arnold Palmer, but I could be the only one golf writer on Arnold Palmer Drive. And I started doing stuff with Arnold Palmer, and I got to know him pretty well. I'll never forget the first time I went in there. I was very, very respectful, and I said, "Mr. Palmer, I want you to know how much I've been looking forward to hearing your historic insights into these matters." He said, "I want you to know how much I look forward to guys like you coming here blowing so much sweet smoke up my ass." And so I ended up interviewing him over 100 times over 20 years, and got the book out of it. Jim Nance said that's the best book anyone's written about Arnold Palmer. And I think it's because it's not so much about Arnold Palmer, it's about how his neighbors viewed him. I did a story in the Latrobe Bulletin when I got the idea for the book, and I said, "I'm doing a story on Arnold Palmer. Here's my phone number and my email address. Give me your best stories." I got 210 calls and emails about Arnold Palmer, and there wasn't one bad one. I mean, this is a small town where people are very crabby. You know, like I had somebody say to me, they go, "We love it here." They just moved here from Texas. They go, "We love it here. Everyone's so nice." I said, "If you think everyone's nice, you haven't met everyone." But I thought there'd be some calls saying that he was cheap, he stiffed a waitress, or that he flipped somebody off in traffic, he had a road rage incident. There was nothing. It's like he'd never had a bad day. I wasn't looking for a bad day, but I thought there'd be some hint that, you know, that he had something where he was out of character. He was just happy his whole life. And he was a great man. I really miss seeing him a lot. Fred Rogers I didn't know too well. The one time I actually met him was the National Enquirer called me up in about 1994, and they said, "We want you to do a story about Fred Rogers." I was in a bar downtown Latrobe, and I said, "Oh man," I told my buddy, I said, "The Enquirer wants me to do a story about Fred Rogers." 4 stools down was town drunk Dickie Kemp. And Dickie said, "Fred Rogers, I was just in rehab with his son. What's the story about?" I said, "Dickie, come on down here. I'm buying your drinks the rest of the night." Now, the ethics of me buying drinks for someone who just got out of rehab is a question we'll have to deal with another day. But I wanted to hear Dickie's story. And Dickie told me that Fred Rogers would come and visit his son, who did have a cocaine problem in the 90s. It was referred to in that movie. It was so great. And he said that Fred Rogers would come visit him every Sunday in the rehab, and they'd be out in the rec yard, and he'd be walking along with his son amongst all the rehab people, and they'd started to mock Fred Rogers. They would like talk in his sing-song voice, oh, it's Fred, and hi Fred, how are you doing? Making fun of Mr. Rogers, which is terrible. But then one by one, they would all sit next to him, and one by one, they would all begin to weep. They said talking to him for 10 minutes was better than 6 months of court-ordered classes. And I think that's the best Fred Rogers story there is. You know, it's one thing to him to talk about kids about skinned knees or parents that are arguing, but to fix broken adults is wonderful. Interesting side note, Fred Rogers and Arnold Palmer did not get along. Two of the most wonderful gentlemen in the world, you could really say in the whole world, from this one small town, didn't really get along. Now, I was in Arnold Palmer's, I thought anecdotally I might be misreading this. I was in his office 2 weeks after he won the Congressional Medal of Freedom. And I said, Mr. Palmer, congratulations. How about Latrobe winning 2 Congressional Medal of Freedom awards in the last 2 years? He goes, who won before I did? I said, Fred Rogers won it in 2000. He goes, he did? Damn it. Now that just says something about how competitive he was. I thought, but maybe I misread that. Maybe I was reading too much into it or something like that. But then I thought, I looked on the internet and I couldn't find one picture of these two guys who grew up a year apart from each other in school. Been to many ribbon cuttings. I never found one picture of them together on the internet. Maybe something happened there. Maybe I misread that. Maybe the camera lens was covered or anything like that. Then I thought, Fred Rogers did 905 episodes of His Neighborhood. He had on ballerinas, he had on plumbers, garbage men, politicians, bakers, tailors. He never had on the one man, one of the most popular men in the world, and in fact, his real neighbor. He never had him on. He had on a talking gorilla. And I like to think that they called up and said, well, let's ask the talking gorilla if he can come on. If the talking gorilla says no, then we'll have to ask Palmer. But then my book, Undaunted Optimist, that came out right in the teeth of the pandemic. It's called Essays on Life, Laughter, and Cheerful Perseverance. I found some books in Barnes & Noble that I had signed right before the pandemic started. I put, it's good to be optimistic. I'm positive. I hope you're positive too. Which turned out to be one of the most misfortunate things you could write in the teeth of a pandemic. Bragging about positivity. But I'm finished. I just finished another novel. And these things, I keep thinking one of these is going to be my breakthrough. And everybody assures me, they said, you're going to be very famous. It might be after you're dead, but you're going to be famous one day. I said, I just hope I'm solvent one day. Be fine. But my new novel is called, it's about a Romeo and Juliet story, but instead of Juliet being on a balcony in Verona, she's in heaven. And Romeo's in hell. And to get together, she has to lower heaven and he has to raise hell. And their names are Evan and Elle, and the book is called Evan and Elle in Heaven and Hell, a long-distance social media afterlife love story. So I hope that does well for me. But if it doesn't, it's been such an odd life that I've had, and I've enjoyed it so much. You know, I don't know why I was put in this position. And we talk about what is our purpose in life. My experiences and my outlook lead me to believe that my whole purpose in life is to be interesting company on the guy who sits next to me at the bar for like an hour. But what's next? I hope to live to be 225 now, because I'm 120 now. And I really am believing that years, the only thing that matters on years are on tombstones and prison sentences. Because maybe some of you are like me, you've lived lives where you got a lot done in a few years, and you didn't have to work sometimes, and you really enjoyed your life. I hope you did, because it's a gift. You know, we are so lucky to be here. Fred Rogers, whenever he was in Washington, he'd always go to the Albert Einstein statue, and he'd sit there for like an hour just contemplating it. And Albert Einstein, I don't know whether Fred Rogers knew this or not, he probably did, but some 14-year-old girl wrote Albert Einstein a letter one time and said, what is the meaning of life? And Albert Einstein wrote back, she says, I've thought about it. Now when Albert Einstein says, I've thought about something, everything should stop. Like when I think about something, it's in the morning, I think Lucky Charms or Pop-Tarts. That's the depth of my thinking. But Albert Einstein said, I've thought about it. The meaning of life is why we're here is to help one another. It isn't to like acquire goods or things like that. It's a simple answer, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, that's why we are here. We're here to help one another, to love one another, and make things easier for one another. And I think that's why Fred enjoyed that. And I say, fear not death. Fear instead the deathbed realization that you never really lived. You know, at the end, if you're sitting there and you're thinking, where did it go? What happened to that time? And I say that if you insinuate yourself into enough hearts, you won't live to be 100. You'll live forever. And I'm sure you're all like that with your grandchildren, the people that love you. And I can just tell by the people in this room how much love there is for one another. And I thank you for coming out to hear me talk. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Anybody? Thank you. The books are $20 each if you'd like to buy them. They make great gifts. I can't say which I'd buy more of. Everybody loves the Palmer book, but the Use All the Crayons is very popular. Any questions?
This is a crazy question.
Yeah, good. I'm all attention. I love it.
Why do people refer to Latrobe as Latrobe?
I addressed that in my Fred Rogers book.
Okay.
Which, if you see on the top, on the cover of the book, not on the poster, on the cover of the book, it says Latrobe Edition.
Okay.
Now, I tracked this down. I did more research on this than anybody else has ever done. I tracked down the great-great-great-great-grandson of Benjamin Latrobe. I said, is it Latrobe or Latrobe? He said, it's Latrobe. Now, I said, have you ever been there? He said, no, but I'm a fan of Arnold Palmer's. So I said, well, that gives you some credentials. But then I talked to everybody else, and they said, when we give this cheers at the school fight song, we don't say, give me an L, give me an A. We say, give me an L, give me an A. What's it spelled? Latrobe. So that's how we come with that. And Latrobe sounds more gritty than Latrobe. Latrobe sounds like a village in France. Latrobe is guts.
How's it? I used to do some business with Latrobe Steel.
Yeah.
Which is still there. I think it's owned by Timken.
Yeah.
How's the city of Latrobe doing? And the Steelers camp, I guess, is still one of the highlights of the year out there.
Yeah, we haven't had it in 2 years because of COVID.
Right.
And my one daughter, she drove the trolley through Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, and she also did security for the Steeler camp. And which is funny because she's more slight than me, and she's playing security guard for guys like Ben Roethlisberger and all this others. Steeler camp is a special time out there, and I fear it's going away. You know, there was no reason they couldn't have had it this year because they canceled camp because of COVID precautions. 2 weeks later, they were filling up 80,000 seat football stadiums, armed elbow to elbow. Latrobe itself is doing well, but it could be doing better. I say you can gauge the seediness of your hometown by how close the nearest tattoo parlor is to the town fountain. And we're about 2 blocks away. There's not enough business there. But it's a great town. The people are great. Like my wife was once retiring and shy, and now she's been in Latrobe so long. I said, you've become like a native. She said, what do you mean? I said, you're just a real smart ass now. And I mean that in a good way. You know, the people are just great. They're so much fun. But with the foundations they have out there, I wish that they were doing more outreach and things like that to businesses. But that's typical of a town. I think that the pandemic will help a town like Latrobe. Yeah, I just drove in from Latrobe to Pittsburgh. There was nobody on the roads. I know it's a Friday, but there was nobody there. And I thought, where are these people spending time? So I think a little town like Latrobe, people are going to start to look at, but who knows? Yes?
How did you pick journalism when you went to college?
I had a storytelling bent then, you know, and I got good grades in English and things like that. But I always wanted to tell stories, and the time in Nashville was really pivotal to me. because you'd hear these guys, and they were like me, I am now. You know, they were working on something that they thought is going to be great. They were 58 years old. They've never had any success, but they wrote a song that they were sure Garth Brooks was going to take and was going to change their lives. And it's fun to be around people like that, you know, to be around optimists, pessimists. I say the difference, a pessimist and an optimist are both wrong about 50% of the time, but the optimist is cheerful 100% of the time. So, anyone else? Yes?
Where is the National Geographic? Where did you live?
I never left Latrobe. It's Lantana, Florida. And the funny thing about it is, back then, they weren't political. They were just looking for the best stories. Now they've got a political bent to them. And down in Lantana, Florida. And they were all from Great Britain. All the editors were from Fleet Street tabloids over there. And there are 5 different tabloids: the Globe, the Sun, the Weekly World News, the Inquirer, and I can't remember what the other one is. But at the end of the day, they'd all go to the same bar and tell stories. And I'd sit there just amazed at these stories these guys would tell. And it just was so much fun. But I would go down there once every 6 months. They'd fly me down, and they'd take me to dinner at the Breakers, and I'd just have a ball. I was a young kid and very easily swayed by posh lifestyle. And it was so different. But they were fun. Nobody that I know works there anymore. They've all turned over. So, anyone else?
Okay. Chris, thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back here.
Great program.
Thank you.
You always bring pearls of wisdom. Okay, that's about it for today. Thanks for coming, and